There were more demonstrations across East Germany, with an estimated 500,000 gathering in front of the GDR Parliament and in the Alexanderplatz in East Berlin, with almost no police presence, to demand free elections and listen to speeches from writer Stefan Heim, actress Steffi Sperer, and lawyer Gregor Gysi, among others. The government, rapidly losing control, drafted some new rules on allowing East German citizens to travel, but they were still confusing and complicated, and were denounced by West Berlin Mayor Walter Mompert. The West German embassy in Prague was still being besieged by East German refugees, and now it was time for the Czechoslovakian government to talk about closing the borders from their side. A couple of days after the Australian Grand Prix, 2/3 of the East German Politburo, including Prime Minister Willi Stoph, resigned, leaving Egon Krenz and the remaining third trying to redraft the travel rules. Eventually, a couple of days after that, he decided to just allow people to travel. People would still be required to have a passport, which few had, but these were to be distributed with all speed. To all intents and purposes, the border between West and East Germany would be open, including through the Berlin Wall, and permanent emigration would also be allowed. East Berlin party leader Günter Schabowski went on TV that evening to announce the changes, although he hadn't been involved in any of the discussions and didn't really know what the new rules were. Armed only with a memo and unused to press scrutiny, he read out the new regulations. A reporter asked him when this would take effect. He looked down at the paper. He didn't say. After a moment's hesitation, he answered,
Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort. Unverzüglich.
As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay. Another journalist asked him to confirm that that included the Berlin crossings. He shrugged and read out item 3 on his note, which said it did. As soon as the press conference ended, the news wires to the west were practically melting, and both ZDF and ARD, the two main West German TV networks, featured it as their main story on the evening news. East Berliners watching the West German broadcasts immediately began swarming down to the 6 checkpoints between East and West Berlin, chanting "Wir kommen wieder," "We'll come back." Border guards, completely unaware of Schabowski's press conference, had no idea what was happening, and faced with the choice of letting thousands of people through into West Berlin or opening fire, decided to do the former. The first gate to open was probably Bornholmer Strasse. The Easterners surged through into the west, where they were tearfully greeted with flowers, champagne and wild rejoicing. Later that night, East and West Berliners joined together in climbing onto the hated Berlin Wall and dancing, celebrating, and hacking lumps out of it with sledgehammers. It had been a pretty hectic couple of weeks between races in the world of F1 too. McLaren's appeal of Senna's disqualification from Suzuka was heard by FISA in Paris a week after the race, and not only was the disqualification upheld, but the 1988 champion was called a dangerous driver by the organisation, citing incidents during the 1988 season, and a 6-month suspended ban was added to his disqualification. Both Senna and Ron Dennis were predictably livid, the former saying he was going to quit F1 with immediate effect, and the latter claiming that the FISA hearing had been given a report of the Suzuka incident that had been substantially changed from the one the Japanese stewards had made. Most in the paddock agreed that the punishment was hugely disproportionate to what had, after all, been pretty much the inevitable result of the Senna-Prost rivalry that had been building up for 2 years, with even many who viewed Senna as having been at fault in Japan voicing their discontent and their view that Jean-Marie Balestre was blatantly favouring his countryman Prost. After lengthy discussions with both Ron, Dennis and his family, Senna decided that he would race after all in Adelaide. If nothing else, in the unlikely event that FISA changed their minds, he still needed to win to take the title. And he had a point to prove. And so did Alain. Anyone who had tinnies to keep cold over race weekend could probably have dropped them off at the McLaren motorhome, such was the very frosty atmosphere. But to all intents and purposes, Adelaide was irrelevant as far as the championships were concerned. Of course, that hadn't stopped previous Australian Grand Prix being thoroughly enjoyable, and indeed often contributed to the end-of-term atmosphere with the pressure off. Not that it was an entirely dead rubber, with Williams and Ferrari still closely contesting second place in the Constructors' Championship. Suzuka had seen Williams take the place, but there were still only 5 points in it, while Riccardo Patrese could still take third place in the drivers' standings at the expense of his much-vaunted former teammate Mansell. Pierluigi Martini was back in the Minardi, but otherwise everything was pretty much as it had been in Japan, with a number of drivers taking to the track for the last time in their current teams, or at all in the case of René Arnoux, who officially confirmed his retirement from F1. The 3-year Warwick-Cheever partnership at Arrows was being broken up, Piquet's miserable 2 years at Lotus was ending, as was Nakajima's time there with destination as yet unknown. Emanuele Pirro at Benetton had promised much but not actually delivered much and was also still as yet unsettled for next year. And for many of the smaller, poorer teams, a year of not even making qualifying most of the time, let alone getting any TV coverage for sponsors on race day, meant the futures of teams such as Real, Eurobrun, Zakspeed and Ozella were always in the balance. Larini underlined his credentials as a star for the future in his last race for Ozella by topping PQ for the third race running, with his 1990 Ligier teammate Alio second. Third was Piercarlo Ghinzani in the other Ozella, and a satisfied Ghinzi announced after the session that he too would retire from Formula 1 after this race. In the fourth slot was Leto, meaning that Johansson would miss out again, along with his former Ferrari teammate Michele Alboreto. All 4 qualifiers were actually inside the previous lap record. Aguri Suzuki thus gained the unwanted record of 16 DNPQs in 16 attempts, while Bertaggia had been the slowest in every race he'd entered. Friday qualifying proper saw Prost go fastest by 0.3, with Boots in an excellent third and Martini a fantastic fourth, but in Saturday's cooler session, Ayrton beat his own time by over a second, with Martini a frankly astonishing second on the day to go third overall behind Prost. Sandro Nannini lined up fourth, and Boutsen dropped to fifth alongside Patrese. The Ferrari pair had all kinds of mechanical and setup issues, Mansell only managing 7th, and Berger a demoralised 14th after having a gearbox failure in his race car and not being allowed to use the spare because it had a development engine he wasn't supposed to know existed. One rumour had Ron Dennis poke his head round the door of the Ferrari garage and offer him the use of the spare McLaren. The Pirelli-shod Italians Modena, De Cesaris, Caffi and Larini were next, followed by Brundle and Pirro, with a lazy suffering from bronchitis down in 15th, and Leto a very creditable 17th in his first time at the tricky track, ahead of Piquet. Cheever survived a hair-raising prang late on Saturday to line up 22nd, Nakajima 23rd in his last Lotus race, with Arnoux lining up for his swan song last on the grid. Jonathan Palmer, the first time he'd failed to qualify all year, and a demotivated Sala with an uncertain future, joined the Reals in non-qualification. There was further needling between Prost and Senna after Friday's qualifying, when Prost overtook a slow-moving Berger at the end of his hot lap, moving right over and braking to get out of the way, but it made Senna lift momentarily, and then he threatened to report Prost to the stewards for passing under a yellow flag. "He's mad," said Prost, and Ron Dennis was back in HR mode and presumably looking forward to this no longer being his problem after this weekend. And then on Sunday, the heavens opened, after the morning warm-up and just before the Group A touring car support race. An extra wet weather warm-up session was slotted in, and it looked like it was necessary, with several drivers including Senna and Berger going aquaplaning off and Mansell and Nannini both having huge accidents. With the weather not letting up, and indeed getting worse with an hour before the race, several drivers, led by Prost, Berger and Piquet, approached the stewards to discuss calling off the race. Some were saying they would refuse to drive even if the race did go ahead. Many had nothing really left to drive for this year, and were on their last race for their current team, so had no real fear of breaking their contract either. Senna seemed to be in two minds. He recognised privately that it was too dangerous, but publicly he said he would race, and that he was a contracted driver and that was what he was paid for. The championship might yet still be on the line, and you have to imagine at this stage just publicly agreeing with Prost on anything would have rankled with him. Several of the drivers spoke to motorbike legend Barry Sheene on the grid as discussions continued.
Well, the position, it is a very particular circuit. We have aquaplaning in a lot of places. It's raining very heavily. For sure, if you start the race now, after one lap, we'll be finished the race. Please don't want to start and say start and after you stop. But if you start now, you have a very big danger in the first lap, you have a big accident, and maybe 5 or 6 cars will be a big shunt, and maybe somebody can get hurt. Because apart you don't see anything in the straight. Second, you have aquaplaning. And aquaplaning is the most difficult thing. It's not a mistake of the driver, but you come in the straight, and the car slides, and that's it. You cannot do anything. You know, I think the way it is, it's impossible to start. You know, it's no way.
Very sorry, you know, it's not me, it's not myself. You know, everybody agree. everybody agree not to start. I think it's ridiculous, And we wait for half an hour more, half an hour delay, and it's not a regulation. We can wait half an hour delay. But I can't understand why we wait half an hour. Then maybe we can wait we cannot wait another hour. It's ridiculous. Situation in the straight is unbelievable. If one car spins in the straight, it's a disaster. Okay, I mean, there's a lot of races we have done in the past on a wet track like this. On the visibility side, it's worse than Spa and worse than Silverstone. On the aquaplaning, it's worse than anything I've seen in my career in the straight line. Okay, maybe nothing happened. I say, okay, that was a good race. But if something happens, it's going to be a big one today. And I think it's ridiculous. It's the last race of the championship. And nobody wants to hurt himself. Maybe we can wait 1 hour, maybe 1 hour and a half. Nobody wants to take a plane tonight, and I think it would be better for sport anyway.
Ron Dennis, what do you think of the situation? Every driver has said, well, not every driver, but 99% of them have said it's too dangerous. What do you think?
I think the officials of the race, as they are continuously pointing out to me over the last few days, are the people that have to judge the situation. If they start the race, then they take the responsibility, and we will start.
So in other words, they're just endorsing what you already think about them?
I have no comment.
Okay, thanks, Ron.
Patrese and Piquet toured the circuit with former F1 driver Tim Schenken and starter Roland Brunscherider, and Nelson was seen talking with Bernie Ecclestone on the grid, but eventually everyone agreed to start, some more reluctantly than others, after a suggestion to delay for an hour and see if things improved had been rejected, though Prost and Berger both announced their intention to take the start as instructed, but then pull off at the end of lap 1. Once the decision had been made, there seemed to be an almost unseemly hurry to get things moving, with the parade lap being flagged off while some drivers were still getting in their cars. Senna led the pack, tiptoeing round at a very slow pace, but even then some of the drivers, notably Cheever, were still halfway round the circuit when the green light was given and the race began. Prost and Senna led gingerly off, with Senna losing the lead briefly, but then regaining it into the first corner, while Martini fishtailed wildly on Pirelli's dreadful wet race tyres and lost third to Nannini. Grouillard went off at turn 4, nearly cutting Arnoux' swan song very short indeed, but the veteran managed to keep things going. Just as he'd said he would, Prost pulled in at the end of lap 1 and got out of the car, while both Piquet and Modena went slithering off, but when JJ Leto spun in such a way that his car blocked the chicane, something I can find neither video nor photo of, frustratingly, the race had to be red flagged. And so we were back to square one. Would they restart? Prost said he wouldn't. Others did under protest. Berger was spitting feathers, both at Fieser and at the other drivers for not sticking together. Bernie Ecclestone said he thought Prost would go, and that conditions had improved, with some of the worst puddles broomed off the Brabham Straight. Eventually, everyone except a fuming Prost got back in their cars, whatever their personal thoughts, and with the first attempt scrubbed and the cars refuelled, a new start would take place for the full 81 laps, or more likely 2 hours. The rain had backed off a bit, but it was still falling as the 25 cars were flagged off for the parade lap. Once again, 2 cars were left on the grid, but this time it was because Larini's engine had refused to fire and Alesi's magic box of electronics wasn't working. The Tyrrell was wheeled into the pit lane to be fixed while the Ozella was started and sent off, only to stall for good while forming up at the back. Not wanting to delay the start again, the car was simply pushed off by the marshals while the lights went on. Martini made good use of the hole left by Prost and nearly jumped Senna into the lead, but the McLaren had the grunt and the inside line. Senna, the only man with a clear view, shot off into the lead while Pierluigi skated round on his Pirelli wets, holding everyone else up. Everyone else in this case being led by Boutsen and Patrese, and the Belgian was understandably nervous about passing the Minardi in the conditions. At the end of lap 1, Senna's lead was almost 9 seconds already over Martini, with Nannini close behind the 2 Williamses, and De Cesaris up to 6th, with Mansell behind him. Martini wasn't making life easy for Boutsen, but finally the Belgian got past after a couple of laps, quickly followed by Patrese. At the back, Arnoux and Cheever, 2 of Prost's former Renault teammates, were duelling when Cheever tapped Arnoux into a spin, putting an end to René's career after just 4 laps. There were, as you might expect, incidents all over the place. Alesi's misfiring electrics blipped his engine and sent him slithering off, Berger tripped over Alio and put them both out, and Warwick had a spin when his throttle stuck open, caught by the onboard camera, which also showed just how bad conditions were, as did the one mounted on Cheever's car. Senna, meanwhile, had eased off a bit as Pirot swapped ends but kept it going, and Boutsen began to chip away at Senna's lead, which was some 27 seconds by the end of lap 10. Patrese made a slightly hair-raising pass on Boutsen to take second, only to lose it again, and it was Mansell's turn to have a moment, pirouetting gracefully across the curbs. Senna had a moment of his own, doing a full revolution and a half before rejoining, as did De Cesaris, the right-hander at the end of Jones Straight being the place that seemed to be catching most people out. And then, just a lap after his spin, Senna was spotted emerging from the spray on 3 wheels and half a front wing, and following Martin Brundle's Brabham, which had no rear wing. Martin's rear-view camera had captured Senna looming out of the spray and simply driving right into him unsighted. So, that finally settled the championship, whatever else might later happen in courtrooms and conference suites. And, Senna would later argue, that was also the point where the race should have been stopped, with that last reason for persisting gone. As if to underline the point, Caffey spun off on the same lap as De Cesaris had. So, Boutsen led on lap 15, with Patrese a little further behind than he had been after an off-camera spin cost him a couple of seconds. Nannini was third, Mansell fourth, Martini now fifth, and Cheever sixth. Patrese then spun again, dropping behind Nannini and Mansell as the marshals tried to move to Cesaris's Dallara, which was stuck in a rather awkward spot. Nannini, scenting a second victory just 2 weeks after his first, was chasing Boutsen, while Mansell was also charging, and despite it all it was starting to look like a motor race was developing. Until Nigel charged backwards into the tyre wall. Not a happy bunny. Boutsen caught Pirot to lap him, but the one Benetton wasn't letting him through while the other bore down on the Williams from behind. Emanuele quite aggressively chopping in front as Nannini appeared in the back of shot. Mansell's retirement had promoted Patrese back up to third, with Cheever now fourth, an excellent job after starting right at the back, and Nakajima and Leto, who'd been conducting a tremendous off-camera scrap, up into fifth and sixth on lap 19. The young Finn was acquitting himself well in his first wet race after his early hiccup. Just then Ghinzani, who'd pulled over to allow himself to be lapped by Martini, was rear-ended by Piquet, who, like Senna, simply hadn't seen the car in front. Both Lotus and Ozella were demolished, and Piquet received one of the white car's rear tyres to the helmet. Ghinzani got out and limped away from his F1 career as the leaders tiptoed through the wreckage, and thankfully Piquet seems to have suffered no ill effects from the impact. The red flag was got ready in case it was needed, but put away again, as Nannini seemed to decide that discretion and second place were the better part of valour, and dropped away from Boutsen, who looked comfortable now in the lead, and had lapped everyone up to and including Cheever, who had at some point acquired a bit of someone else's front wing underneath his bodywork, which wasn't exactly helping his car's performance. Leto's electrics gave out after 27 laps, a shame for the young Finn, but he'd kept it on the road when many more experienced drivers hadn't, as his sparring partner Nakajima set the fastest lap. With just 9 drivers still left on the track and an hour still to go on the clock, things settled down as everyone concentrated on just finishing. Pirot reeled in 6th place Martini, looking for his first career point, as Cheever aquaplaned off in front of them, meaning it was now a battle for 5th, and one which Pirot won shortly afterwards. Nakajima, having the race of his life, was now 4th, and with only a few laps to go before the 2-hour limit, was 5 seconds behind Patrese and charging, hoping to cap a pretty dire season by being the first Japanese driver ever to take a podium finish. He reclaimed the fastest lap from Boutsen on lap 64, but couldn't make it in the time remaining, and Boutsen came home after 70 laps and 2 hours to take his second career win, with Nannini second, and Patrese coming home third, his 6th podium finish of the year, to seal his 3rd place in the standings, with Williams finishing up nicely clear of Ferrari in the Constructors. Nakajima equalled his previous best result to take 3 points for Lotus, which lifted them ahead of Arrows in the standings. Pirot put his first career points on the board, and Martini capped a pretty good season for Minardi with the final point. Mauricio Gugelmin underlined the kind of season March would be glad to see the back of by being one of only 2 drivers to finish but not score, with Stefano Modena trailing in 6 laps down after a series of spins. The first points finishes of the year for Nakajima and the first career point for Pirot brought the number of point scorers in the year to a frankly ridiculous 29 drivers representing 16 teams, with only Ozella, Coloni, Zakspeed and Eurobrunn failing to trouble the scorers all year, and in the latter's case failing to trouble the starters either. And that was 1989. one of the most controversial championships in F1's history, and while McLaren remained dominant, there was much more of a sense that the others had caught up a bit. Two popular new winners in Thierry Boutsen and Alessandro Nannini. Nigel Mansell cemented himself as a fan favourite at Ferrari, and the rapid rise of the Onyx team from bottom of Prix qualifying in Brazil to the podium of Portugal was also a story that a lot of people had followed. There are many changes afoot both in the paddock and the world at large as we prepare to enter the 1990s.